All right, let's dive headfirst into the golden age of piracy. Today, we're exploring the two most legendary pirate strongholds the world has ever seen, the sprawling, sinful city of Port Royal and the rugged, unbreakable island fortress of Tortuga. This is a tale of two very different havens.
To really get a grip on what Port Royal was all about, you just need to know this one phrase from the old chronicles, Sodoma del Nuevo Mundo. It means Sodom of the New World. Yeah, the folks back in Europe basically saw it as the ultimate city of sin, just overflowing with crooks, lowlifes, and every vice you can imagine.
And that's really the heart of our story, isn't it? On one side, you have Port Royal in Jamaica, a huge, chaotic, bustling city. On the other, the island of Tortuga, a harsh, rocky citadel. One was a city built for pleasure and plunder. The other was a fortress built for war.
So here's what we're going to cover. We'll look at how these dens got started, how they were built, what life was actually like inside them, and of course, how their incredible stories finally came to a dramatic end.
Okay, first things first. It's so important to understand that these places were not just some little hideaways in the middle of nowhere. Nope. For a time, Port Royal and Tortuga were the absolute epicenters of the entire Caribbean, both politically and economically. They were a serious thorn in the side of the Spanish Empire.
So, how did these infamous pirate havens even get started? Well, and this is the really wild part, they weren't accidents. Not at all. They were actually created on purpose by rival European empires.
You can see it right here. Both of them started out as strategic military moves. Back in 1655, an English admiral named William Penn snatched Jamaica from Spain, and boom, Port Royal was born. A little earlier, around 1640, the French did the exact same thing with Tortuga. These were basically government-approved forward bases in the fight against Spain's dominance.
And this quote, which they say came from the governors of the islands, it just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly sums up the official policy, plausible deniability. In public, they'd say, oh, piracy is terrible, but behind closed doors, they were handing out these things called letters of marque, which were basically licenses for pirates to go ahead and attack Spanish ships.
And, the motives were crystal clear. For guys like King Charles II of England and King Louis XIV of France, who were actually cousins, by the way, these pirates were an off-the-books navy. It was a way to mess with their Spanish rivals, bleed their colonies dry of silver and gold, and funnel all that stolen wealth right back home to London and Paris.
Okay, let's shift gears and look at the actual lay of the land, because the geography of these two spots had a huge impact on what they became and how they ended. And trust me, they were polar opposites.
So, Port Royal, it was basically man-made. It was this massive, booming city built on a really shaky strip of sand. Now, this made it a great harbor for business and for launching raids, for sure. But its foundation, it was just as unstable as the lives of the men who lived there.
Tortuga, though, totally different story. It was a natural fortress. Its name actually means turtle, because its mountains look like a giant turtle shell sticking out of the water. To the north, you had these massive cliffs you just couldn't climb, and to the south, the harbor was guarded by dangerous coral reefs with these tiny little channels that only a skilled pirate captain could get his ship.
And here's the perfect example of just how defensive Tortuga was. Their main fort, Fort de Rocher, was an absolute beast of military design. It was sitting on a cliff, had 24 huge cannons, its own freshwater spring so they'd never run out, and you could only get to it by one single tiny path. Good luck trying to attack that thing. It was basically untouchable.
So, what was it really like to live in these places? For the pirates, or filibusters as they were sometimes called, life was completely different depending on which haven you were in. The two societies were just worlds apart.
Port Royal was, well, it was a crazy, chaotic melting pot. It was the place to go if you were running from something or trying to make a quick fortune. You had English pirates, French filibusters, Dutch ex-soldiers, Spanish deserters, freed slaves, fugitives, even prostitutes shipped in from Europe. Everyone all crammed together in this massive, lawless city.
And the one word to describe life there? Debauchery. Seriously, when pirates got back with a haul, they'd blow through their entire share in just one night of drinking and partying. Get this, the records show that on High Street, the main drag, there was one tavern for every 10 guys. Just wow.
But over in Tortuga, things were different. It was still a pirate den, don't get me wrong, but it was way more organized. It was the home of the famous Brethren of the Coast. And these guys weren't just a random mob. They were a brotherhood with their own set of rules, their own code.
And this is the key thing to get about them. Their social setup was so different that Europeans called it an abominable democracy. Can you believe that? They had this surprisingly fair system for splitting up the loot. Yeah, the governor and captain got their cut, but they also set aside shares to pay out any pirate who got injured, lost an eye, a leg, whatever. It was basically a form of workers' comp, something you'd never ever see back in the monarchies of Europe.
All right, let's get to the grand finale. The endings for these two legendary places were just as different as everything else about them. One went out with a bang, a real act of God, and the other just kind of fizzled out with some paperwork.
Port Royal's end was biblical. It was fast, it was violent, it was spectacular. When word got back to Europe about what happened, pretty much everyone saw it as an act of God. Divine justice finally catching up with the most wicked city on the planet.
So here's what happened. On June 7th, 1692, a huge earthquake rocked Jamaica. That sandy ground Port Royal was built on, it basically turned into liquid, like quicksand. And just as buildings and people were sinking into the ground, 3 massive tsunamis came and just wiped the rest of the city right off the mat, straight into the sea.
The cost in human life was just staggering. Almost 3,000 people died right then and there. But it didn't stop. In the weeks after, diseases and epidemics spread like wildfire from all the bodies trapped in the rubble, killing another 2,000 people. And just like that, the Sodom of the New World was gone.
And Tortuga, its ending was the polar opposite. No earthquake, no giant waves. Its fate wasn't decided by nature, but by politics. It was the slow, steady creep of government control that did it in.
Essentially, Tortuga got domesticated. The French crown had used the pirates to do their dirty work against Spain, and now they didn't really need them anymore. So the French West India Company came in, took over, and slowly but surely the whole pirate culture just faded away, replaced by official business and government rule. The fortress just became another colony.
So that kind of leaves us with one big question, right? When you look back at this story, one place wiped out by nature, the other swallowed up by the state, you have to wonder, who were these pirates really? Were they just a bunch of greedy, ruthless outlaws? Or was it more complicated than that? Were they maybe just pawns in a bigger game? The unofficial, deniable, and ultimately disposable tools of competing global empires?